my daughter's wedding, I expected a seat of honor. Instead, her groom sat me by the kitchen, where waiters rushed past and no one knew I was the father. The shame burned, but I stayed quiet. They thought I was powerless. They didn't know I still controlled the future of this wedding, so I smiled and canceled everything. Follow my story to the end, and comment the city you're watching from. The spring sunlight poured through the tall windows of the old warehouse turned wedding hall, giving the brick walls a warm, golden glow. For a moment, standing there in my worn but freshly pressed suit, pride swelled inside. My daughter was getting married. After all the years of watching her grow, of working late shifts to keep food on the table after her mother left. Today was supposed to be a kind of reward, a day where a father could finally stand tall beside his child. The room glittered with chandeliers hung from the rafters and tables dressed in white linen, each centerpiece a burst of roses and tulips. I had helped pay for those flowers, though no one here would know. I ran a calloused hand along the edge of a chair as I took it all in, the smell of polish and perfume heavy in the air. My chest felt tight with a mixture of nerves and something close to joy. A young man in a vest, hardly older than Shanda had been when she first went to prom, walked over briskly with a clipboard. "Mr. Kempler?" he asked. "Yes," I answered. "This way, sir. We've got your seat ready." I followed, expecting to be led near the front, where fathers belong. Instead, the path wound toward the back corner, past the gleaming tables filled with favors and menus. He stopped beside a plain chair tucked by the swinging kitchen door. Waiters hurried in and out, the clatter of trays and the hiss of steam just behind the wall. "This will be convenient for you," he said politely, already moving away. I stared at the chair, then at the grand archway at the front, where the ceremony would be. A father of the bride belonged there, not here in the shadows. The words rose to my lips, ready to object, but then I thought of Shanda, radiant in her gown, and the risk of making a scene. She deserved a perfect day. So I lowered myself into the chair, back stiff, heart heavy. The smell of roasted chicken drifted from the kitchen, mixing with the sweet scent of roses. Guests began streaming in, filling the hall with chatter and laughter. I watched as they hugged Travis's parents, Eldon and Marla, congratulating them warmly. My seat felt colder with each minute. A middle-aged woman in a sequined dress paused near me, her brow furrowed. "Oh, excuse me," she said kindly. "Are you with the catering staff?" "No," I replied. She tilted her head, confused, then smiled faintly and moved on. Another guest stopped, shaking my hand lightly. "Which side are you from? Groom's or bride's distant family?" "Bride's father," I whispered, but my words were lost in the swell of laughter across the room. Not one person looked back, not one seemed to hear. Each mistaken glance struck sharper than words could. To sit in the shadows while the hall celebrated, was there anything crueler for a parent? Memories pressed forward, unbidden. Late nights at the kitchen table helping Shanda with math homework. Standing on freezing sidelines while she played soccer. The day she cried over her first heartbreak, and I sat silently, letting her tears soak my shoulder. All those years, all that effort. And now my seat was here, by the clang of dishes and the smell of soap from the kitchen sink. I shifted, hoping to see her, just once before the ceremony. Instead, my eyes caught Lorraine, my ex-wife, guiding Eldon and Marla to their front row seats. She was elegant as always, her hand resting warmly on Marla's arm, making sure they were comfortable. The contrast hit me like a stone. They were cherished, displayed, celebrated. I was hidden. The music began to swell, strings lifting into a joyous melody. Everyone rose, turning toward the aisle. My chest tightened, breath caught in my throat. The applause thundered as Shanda stepped into the room, radiant, every head turned to admire her. And there I sat, invisible by the kitchen door. The thought formed sharp and bitter. Did she let this happen? The murmur of the crowd swelled like a tide while I sat there, half-shadowed by the swinging door of the kitchen. The clink of plates and the shuffle of servers blended with laughter from the other side of the hall. Then, Without warning, a young waiter leaned in close, his breath carrying the scent of coffee. He whispered as though sharing a joke. "The groom thought your look didn't match the theme. That's why they put you here." The words sank like a stone in my chest. For a second, it felt as though the floor might tilt beneath me. I held my face steady, gave a faint nod as though the remark hadn't mattered. But every part of me recoiled. The suit I had pressed just last night, the shoes I had polished until my hands ached, suddenly they felt like rags. Around me, laughter rolled through the tables. I caught sight of clusters of guests, glasses raised, their shoulders loose with comfort. The glow of candlelight gave their joy a soft, golden edge. In that warmth, my corner felt like a cold exile. I shifted slightly, straightening my jacket, but the echo of the waiter's words clung tight. I reminded myself that silence was my armor. Making a scene would only stain the day for Shanda. I told myself this again and again, though the bitterness pressed harder with each passing second. My throat ached with unspoken words. Yet I stayed still, hands folded over my cane. A ripple of motion pulled my eyes toward the center of the hall. Shanda walked by, flanked by her bridesmaids. Her dress shimmered under the lights, and for a fleeting moment, the little girl I once carried on my shoulders flashed before me. She turned her head ever so slightly, and our eyes met. It lasted no longer than a heartbeat, but it was enough. She saw me. She saw exactly where I sat, pressed against the wall by the kitchen door. My chest tightened with hope that she might pause, say something, call me forward. Instead, her gaze flickered away, and she linked arms with Travis, her smile lifting toward him as though nothing were out of place. The sting of that silence cut deeper than the waiter's careless words. She had noticed, and she had chosen not to act. A father dreams of walking his daughter down the aisle, of standing proudly beside her. Instead, I was a ghost at her celebration, acknowledged only by my own doubt. Lorraine's laugh rang out from the front rows. My ex-wife floated across the room in a dress brighter than the flowers. Her voice pitched to draw every eye. She greeted Eldon and Marla Kraft with the ease of an old hostess, placing herself right where everyone would see. Watching her, I was struck by how naturally she erased me, as though the years of raising Shanda alone had been no more than a footnote in someone else's story. The memories pressed in, uninvited, nights of homework at the kitchen table, mornings rushing to catch the school bus, the way Shanda's small hand once clung to mine when she was afraid of storms. Each memory clashed against the sight of her now, arm in arm with Travis, smiling at his parents as though they were the ones who had carried her through all those years. My fingers tightened around the cane, the wood biting into my palm. For a moment, I thought of standing, walking straight up to the front, and demanding the seat that was mine by right. The urge was sharp, pulsing through me with every cheer and every laugh. But then Shanda leaned toward Marla Kraft, her smile radiant, her laughter light. She seemed at ease, perfectly comfortable with the arrangement. The realization settled heavy. Maybe this was what she wanted all along. A hollow silence opened inside me, louder than the music and the chatter. Her silence spoke volumes. And in that silence, I heard something I had feared since the day she first called another man Dad when she was small. A betrayal, quiet and complete. Her silence spoke louder than any words, and in that silence, I heard a betrayal I had feared all my life. The clinking of glasses and bursts of laughter wrapped around the room like a tide. Yet at my table by the kitchen door, silence pressed in tight. The sting of Shanda's glance and her choice to turn away still lingered. A waiter passed briskly behind me, the door to the kitchen swinging with the smell of garlic and roast meat, while the MC tapped the microphone, calling the room to order. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced with buoyant cheer, "please welcome Eldon and Marla Kraft, proud parents of the groom, to share a few words." The room erupted in applause, chairs scraping as guests leaned forward. Eldon strode to the microphone with Marla at his side, their smiles broad and confident. From my seat, I caught the reflection of their glow in the glasses on every table. Eldon spoke of Travis's childhood, his Little League games, his grades, the nights they stayed up talking about his dreams. His voice carried a warmth that wrapped itself around the guests, pulling them closer. Heads nodded, Hands clapped. I watched, my palms tightening against my cane, as one story after another painted their family as the rock upon which this marriage stood. Not a whisper of my daughter, not a word of the years I had poured into her life. My place in the story was an empty seat, invisible even as I sat among them. The guests looked toward Eldon and Marla with admiration, some whispering about their wonderful job, raising such a fine man. My chest ached, the contrast sharp as glass. They basked in visible honor, while I sat shrouded in silence. The applause swelled as Marla finished her gentle words, thanking everyone for welcoming Shanda into their family. Then, as the room quieted again, Lorraine stepped forward. My breath caught. Oh, she carried herself with the same practiced poise I remembered from years past, her voice smooth, her smile perfectly calibrated for sympathy. "Shanda," she began, "you have always been my brightest light. Through the ups and downs, I've been at your side, guiding you, protecting you, making sure you had the stability you always needed." Stability. The word landed like a blow, a careful, sharp way of saying that I had never provided it. She went on, thanking Travis for completing our family, her eyes glistening just enough to draw murmurs of approval from the crowd. Every sentence seemed polished to erase me, to reframe the years of single fatherhood as a gap she had filled. My knuckles whitened around the cane. Memories rose like waves crashing over her words, the double shifts at the hardware store so Shanda could keep her piano lessons, the nights I sat at the kitchen table helping her with algebra until midnight, the mornings I walked her to school in the rain. Each image clashed against Lorraine's polished narrative until I could barely breathe. What I had lived, she was rewriting before my eyes. I stared at the floor, willing myself not to stand, not to shout the truth into the room. Dignity. I reminded myself, if nothing else, I could keep that. To rise now, to interrupt, would only cast me as bitter, a relic unfit for the bright new family Shanda seemed to have chosen. The applause thundered for Lorraine. Guests rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, some dabbing at their eyes. Shanda leaned into Travis, smiling, her face glowing under the lights. Not once did she look back. My heart pounded against my ribs as though trying to escape. For the first time, the fear rooted deep inside me took shape. Perhaps this night was not just about seating or speeches. Perhaps it was the beginning of being erased from her life altogether. As the applause roared for her words, I sat still, my heart hammering, asking myself if silence was my shield or my coffin. The applause from Lorraine's speech was still fading when Travis stepped forward, his posture tall and sure, the kind of confidence that drew every eye to him. The microphone in his hand seemed less like a tool and more like a crown. From where I sat by the kitchen door, I could see the faint glint in his eyes, a look that said this was his stage now. My chest tightened. I already knew what was coming. He began with an easy smile, his voice carrying across the hall with a practiced charm. "First, let me thank my wonderful parents-in-law, Lorraine, Eldon, and Marla. Without the stability you all provided, Shanda wouldn't be the incredible woman she is today." The room erupted in warm applause, heads nodding in agreement, glasses raised toward the crafts and Lorraine. No one glanced my way. Not a soul seemed to wonder if the father who had raised Shanda through scraped knees and broken hearts had been thanked. It was as though I had been erased from the script entirely. A life's worth of effort, condensed into silence. His words pressed against old wounds, reopening them. I had worked 2 jobs to keep a roof over our heads after the divorce, had sat through piano lessons and late-night fevers, had bought her prom dress with money saved from skipped meals. But now, none of it mattered in this room. According to Travis, the credit belonged elsewhere. Then his eyes shifted toward me. The smile never faltered, but the warmth drained out of it. "Family," he continued, voice dipped in a tone only slightly sweeter than mockery, "means supporting those who sometimes can't support themselves." A ripple of polite laughter circled the tables. Some guests chuckled awkwardly, unsure if they had heard what they thought they did, but the subtext rang clear in my ears. I was the one who couldn't support myself. I was the one who had become the burden. The heat rose in my face, spreading down my neck. My hands tightened around the cane resting against my leg, the wood digging into my palm. Part of me wanted to shout, to rise and demand the truth be spoken, that I was not some fragile relic to be pitied, but the man who had kept Shandah's world from falling apart. But the weight of 72 years held me still. Travis carried on, basking in his moment. "We all know that time moves forward," he said, lifting his glass. "And as it does, we learn to care for one another, even those who came before us." The words hung in the air, delivered with a genial grin to the room. It was a toast to family. To me, it was a sentence, a branding. Old, dependent, a man who had outlived his usefulness. My jaw clenched. Around me, glasses clinked. The cheers rose. And Shandah smiled at him with a softness that made my heart ache. Every muscle inside me fought against the urge to stand. My silence wasn't just restraint anymore. It was a storm, gathering behind my ribs, waiting for the moment when it would break loose. Travis thought he had written the last word of my story. He had no idea the ending was mine to decide. His words weren't a toast. They were a sentence. And I knew the time for silence was nearing its end. The clinking of glasses still echoed faintly from Travis's toast. His words, those veiled barbs disguised as warmth, hung in the air like smoke no one dared to clear away. My hand pressed harder against the cane resting beside me, its weight familiar, its wood polished smooth by years of use. The thought came sharp and unshakable. Enough. The ache in my knees was nothing compared to the ache of being erased. Slowly, carefully, I pushed myself upright. The scrape of my chair against the polished floor drew more attention than I intended. Conversations dimmed, forks paused in midair. Dozens of faces swiveled toward me, curiosity flickering, then surprise. I gripped the edge of the table for balance, cane in the other hand, and cleared my throat. The microphone sat abandoned on its stand, still warm from Travis's touch. Each step toward it was heavy, but also freeing. When I reached it, I leaned closer, my voice steady but low, the kind that demanded silence without ever raising in volume. "I only want a moment," I said, scanning the room. A moment to speak as Shandah's father. A hush fell. Even the servers at the edges of the hall froze, trays balanced on their hands. Memories rose unbidden, as though pulled up by the weight of my own voice. I remember working double shifts so Shandah could keep her piano lessons. I remember staying up all night sewing sequins back onto a dress for her recital. I remember dropping her off at college, watching her walk away with more courage than I ever had at her age. The faces before me softened. A few nodded slowly, perhaps seeing her through my eyes for the first time. I felt steadiness grow in my chest, a long-dormant sense of worth. "This day isn't just about where she is now," I continued. "It's about the road that brought her here. A road paved with sacrifice, with love that never asked for applause." Then, a laugh, sharp and cutting, shattered the moment. Travis leaned back in his chair, one arm thrown lazily over the backrest. "Come on," he said loud enough for all to hear. "Let's not drown the evening in old man stories." A ripple of uneasy laughter moved through the crowd. Some guests chuckled politely, unwilling to cross the Groom. Others looked down at their plates, shame flashing briefly before they hid it. My heart thudded hard against my ribs. Shandah shifted in her seat at the head table. Our eyes met, just for a second. She looked away quickly, her hand tightening around Travis's arm. Loyalty or fear, I couldn't tell. The microphone trembled slightly in my grip. I steadied it, and my voice dropped lower, quieter than before, yet sharper. "These aren't just stories. They're truths. Nights when I came home so tired I could barely stand, but still sat by her bed until she fell asleep. Hours spent at jobs I hated, so she would never feel the weight of what we lacked. Every father dreams of this day, not for himself, but for his daughter. And when it comes, it is not about erasing the past. It is about honoring it." The room stilled. Not a fork moved. Not a glass clinked. Even Travis's smirk faltered. a shadow of unease crossing his face. I gripped the microphone tighter. The storm inside no longer contained. My silence had ended. If Travis wanted to erase me from this story, then I would carve my truth into it, whether he liked it or not. The clinking of glasses had barely faded when Travis leaned toward me, his smile stretched too wide, his eyes sharp with something only I was meant to see. His voice dropped low, soft enough that no one else could catch it. "You don't know what you're up against, old man," he whispered. "By the time the cake's cut, the papers will already be moving." The words landed like ice water down my spine. I froze, my hand tightening around the cane resting against my chair. On this night of supposed joy, in the hall filled with flowers and laughter, my own daughter's groom had chosen to spit his venom into my ear. I forced my face into something neutral, maybe even amused, as if he had told me a private joke. No guest would see my shock. No one would see how the floor seemed to tilt beneath me. He leaned back, raising his champagne flute casually. "Don't worry," he added, his tone drenched in mock kindness. "You'll be looked after, just not by yourself anymore." A memory flickered, sudden and sharp. Weeks ago, an envelope from the bank had been left on the hall table. My name, missing. I'd thought it was a clerical error, nothing more. Now, hearing Travis's words, the truth slid into place with a sickening weight. This wasn't only about humiliation. He was planning to erase me entirely. The murmur of guests rose around us, laughter punctuating the air, oblivious to the knife pressed silently against my future. I sipped at my glass of water, the tremor in my hand hidden by years of practice. Across the room, Shanda's gaze brushed mine. She must have noticed something in Travis's lean toward me. Her eyes held a flicker of unease, but she turned away, nestling closer to his side. Complicit or blind? The question twisted deep in my chest. I studied Travis, the tuxedo, the practiced grin, the hand resting like a claim on my daughter's arm. All of it was just a disguise. Behind it, calculation gleamed. He wasn't celebrating a marriage. He was securing territory. And then, another memory cut through. Months ago, Lorraine had stood in my kitchen, papers in her hand. "Just something simple," she'd said lightly, asking for my signature. I hadn't signed then, suspicion tugging at me, but now I wondered if I'd already been maneuvered into some other corner I hadn't seen. Betrayal thickened in the air around me. Not only from Travis, but perhaps from the woman I once trusted enough to marry. The thought coiled in my gut until it burned. I clenched my jaw, willing myself to stay seated, to not erupt here, under the glow of chandeliers and the gaze of strangers. No, not yet. Outrage wanted me to shout, to tear the microphone from its stand and expose him, but something older, sharper, steadier held me back. This wasn't the moment to fight. It was the moment to remember, to observe, to bide time until the truth lay bare before me. I lifted my glass, my hand steady now. Guests around me followed, mistaking the hollow smile on my face for contentment. "To family," I said quietly, the words bitter in my mouth. Inside, a vow formed, solid as stone. If they thought they'd already buried me, they'd regret not checking if I was still breathing. In that moment, I understood. The wedding wasn't just a celebration. It was their stage to announce my funeral without saying the word. Morning light slipped through the thin curtains, casting lines across the old armchair where sleep had finally claimed me. The echoes of the wedding still clung like smoke, laughter, applause. The way Travis's voice cut through it all with barbed charm, rising stiffly. I shuffled toward the front door, my bones still aching more from what had been said than from years. That's when I saw it. A thick envelope, cream-colored, stamped with the insignia of a law firm I didn't recognize, slid under the door like a silent snake. For a long moment, I just stared, hands trembling. I bent to pick it up, the paper cool against my skin. The flap tore too easily under my thumb, spilling out sheets that smelled of toner and betrayal. Words blurred together, petition for guardianship, unable to manage his affairs, best interests. Then the signatures stopped me cold. Travis Skelton. And below it, clear as a bell, Shanda Reeves, my daughter, my only child, the girl whose first piano recital I had clapped for until my hands ached, the girl I worked nights to send through college, the girl who had once promised, "Dad, I'll never leave you behind." The ink told me otherwise. I sank into the chair, papers spread across my knees. Each sentence was a hammer blow. They claimed I was unfit, incapable, that I couldn't handle my own life. They wanted my house, my bank accounts, my dignity, and worst of all, her name was there, written as neatly as when she'd first signed a birthday card with a backward S. My eyes stung. Pride and sorrow twisted inside until I could barely breathe. For a few minutes, I drifted in memories. Shanda, at 16, slamming the door after her mother and I divorced. Shanda, at 20, hugging me before she left for college. Shanda, at 32, standing in her wedding dress, eyes sliding past me like I was a stranger. Each memory carried weight, and together they felt like a verdict. A knock startled me. I folded the papers quickly, slipping them under the arm of the chair. Opening the door, I found a young man shifting on his feet, dressed plainly, but his face familiar. Devin Riker, the waiter from the wedding. "Mr. Kempler," he asked, voice nervous but earnest. I nodded slowly. "You're one of the servers." "Yes, sir." He glanced down the street before continuing. I shouldn't be here, but I thought you ought to know. Last night, while I was clearing glasses, I overheard the groom, Travis. He was laughing with another guest. Said something about taking the old man's house before winter. Said the papers were already moving. The words landed like another blow, but this time, something steadier rose inside me. Hope, thin but solid. Proof that I wasn't imagining the storm building around me. Someone else had seen it. Someone had heard. Devin shifted again, as if ready to bolt. "I don't want trouble, sir, but it didn't sit right with me. You deserve to know." I studied the young man's face. Nervous, yes, but there was truth in his eyes. I placed a hand on his shoulder, steadying him. "You did the right thing coming here, more right than most of the family I thought I could count on." He nodded, relief flickering, then stepped back toward the sidewalk. "Be careful, they're planning something. I don't know what, but it sounded big." When the door closed behind him, silence filled the room again. I pulled the papers back into my lap, the signatures bleeding into my vision. Rage pulsed, but beneath it, a cold clarity settled. If they wanted to bury me, they'd chosen the wrong grave. I raised a glass of water from the side table, a poor man's toast. My voice was steady, though it cracked the quiet. If they want war, they just declared it. The papers shook in my hands, but my heart had stopped trembling. They thought age meant weakness. They thought silence meant defeat. They forgot silence can be sharper than any shout. And now, their signatures had written the opening lines of a battle they weren't ready for. The ink blurred again. But through the blur, I saw one thing with perfect clarity. I would not go down quietly. Lorraine's house glowed like a lantern in the cool night, laughter spilling faintly onto the street. Cars crowded the curb, a parade of polished chrome and tinted windows. My old Buick looked like a relic among them, and maybe that was fitting. I stepped out, cane in one hand, thick envelope in the other. Each step toward the door carried the weight of betrayal, but also a fire I hadn't felt in years. Inside, the chatter dulled the moment I crossed the threshold. Eyes flicked up from glasses of wine, plates of leftovers. My ex-wife stiffened at the sight of me, her smile freezing mid-sentence. Shanda's face blanched. Travis leaned back in his chair like he'd expected this. Without a word, I lifted the envelope and let it flap against my palm. "Thought I'd join the family gathering," I said evenly, "since you've already written me into it, or out of it." A hush settled. The only sound was the clock ticking above the mantel. Shanda moved first, her voice too bright, too quick. "Dad, it's not what you think. It's just protection, for your future, you know, so you'll be taken care of." Her eyes darted to Travis as though seeking a cue. "Protection?" My voice trembled. not from frailty, but from fury held tight on a leash. I snapped the envelope open, pulling the petition free so everyone could see the black ink. You call this protection? Stripping me of the right to sign my own name? Deciding I'm unfit to live the life I built with my own two hands? Travis's smirk spread like oil across his face. He stood slowly, glass in hand. Mr. Kempler, with all respect, this is best for everyone. Stability, security. Families need to plan ahead. Shanda and I are only thinking of what's right. His tone was practiced, politician smooth. Lorraine's gaze sank to the floor, avoiding me entirely. Eldon and Marla Kraft, perched on the sofa like shareholders at a board meeting, leaned close and whispered, their nods approving. To them, it was a transaction, tidy, logical. I steadied myself on the cane, the words spilling before I could stop them. Do you know what planning ahead looked like for me? It was 3 mortgages refinanced so Shanda could stay in school when I got laid off. It was nights I went hungry so she could eat. It was walking 2 miles to work in February because the car needed repairs for her to drive to college. Every cent, every breath, every piece of my life poured into hers. And you sit here, my eyes cut to Travis, and call me a burden? The silence grew heavier. Guests shifted uncomfortably. Forks scraped against plates, but no one spoke. Even Lorraine flinched, though she didn't lift her eyes. Then, from the back of the room, a voice cleared the air. Janice Rowden, an old friend I hadn't seen in years, hair silver now, but eyes sharp as ever, stepped forward. That's enough, she said. The firmness in her tone cut through the tension. I heard him. At the reception, Travis bragged about taking this man's property by Christmas. Thought it was funny. Thought no one was listening. Gasps rippled. Shanda's hand flew to her mouth, eyes wide. Travis's smirk faltered, the mask cracking as he turned toward Janice, glare sharp and dangerous. The room fractured, murmurs rising, people looking at each other, unsure where to stand. For the first time all evening, the air wasn't just heavy with betrayal, it carried the scent of doubt, of fracture. I stepped forward, laid the papers flat on Lorraine's polished table. If you want to fight over my life, then you'll have to do it in the open. No whispers. No signatures slipped under doors. Face me. Face the truth. Face what I've given and what you're trying to take. The words hung there like smoke, and for the first time that night, Travis's grin slipped, the edges of his mask trembling. In that crack, I saw what I needed. The battle had finally begun. The house was too quiet. Days had passed since I stood in Lorraine's living room. Papers on the table. The air thick with betrayal. Now only the hum of the refrigerator and the creak of the old clock filled the silence. I sat in my chair, staring at the dent my cane had left in the floorboard after that night. Every sound outside, the mail truck, a neighbor's mower, felt distant, like the world had quietly shifted me out of focus. The phone rang, cutting through the stillness. I reached for it with a hand heavier than it should have been. On the line was a neighbor, her voice polite but strained. Orville, I heard some things. Folks are saying you've been having trouble, forgetting things, acting confused. She trailed off, embarrassed. Before I could answer, she excused herself and hung up. Another call came later. Colder. A man from church hinting they'd be praying for my health. By the third call, I didn't need explanations. Travis had begun his work. I didn't have to wait long for proof. A notice arrived from my bank, crisp and clinical. We received inquiries regarding your account management and competency. My name, once secure, was now the subject of whispers behind glass counters. Travis was painting me as senile, and the brushstrokes were already staining the canvas of my life. When Shanda came by the next afternoon, I hoped for even a flicker of doubt in her eyes. Instead, her voice carried the sharp edge of someone rehearsed. Dad, you're making this harder than it needs to be. Travis is just trying to help. If you'd sign things over, peacefully, we could avoid all this ugliness. She folded her arms, her wedding ring catching the light. But if you won't, Then I'll have no choice but to protect myself. Protect us. Her words cut deeper than any rumor. I didn't shout, didn't plead. I only sat there, silence thick around me. Silence that carried all the nights I stayed awake over bills. All the mornings I packed her lunch before heading to a double shift. Her gaze wavered for a second, but she turned away before it could soften. Later, Lorraine called, not to comfort, not to defend, but to remind me of the obvious. You're not young anymore. Orville, maybe this is for the best. Stability is what Shanda needs. The same woman who once left me to raise a child alone now stood just close enough to Travis's shadow to feel secure. That night, as the weight pressed on me, memories forced their way in. The sound of Shanda's laughter in the kitchen as a little girl, the scrape of my hands fixing the old car so she could drive to prom, all those sacrifices had been real, and yet now they were being erased by ink and whispers. But not everyone was fooled. Janice Rowden came by, her knock timid but her eyes steady when I opened the door. She sat at my kitchen table, sipping tea from a mug I hadn't dusted off in years. I know what I heard, she said. Travis isn't planning for your future. He's planning to take it. Don't let their lies bury you. You're not alone in this. Her words steadied something inside me. Shame loosened its grip. I wasn't powerless. I was cornered. Yes, but not finished. As she left, I promised myself I'd find a way to fight. The next morning, an envelope waited in my mailbox. Official, heavy, stamped with the court's insignia. I opened it with trembling fingers. Guardianship petition, filed against me. They weren't asking anymore. I held the letter in my hands, its ink heavier than iron. They weren't just stealing from me. They were trying to erase me. The courthouse steps felt colder than I remembered. Franklin County's courthouse loomed above me like a gray reminder that my own flesh and blood thought I couldn't handle my life anymore. As I walked through the heavy doors, I caught sight of familiar faces. Shanda, Travis, Lorraine, even the Crafts, yet not one of them looked at me. To them, I wasn't a father, or even a man. I was a case file, a burden they hoped to file away. The absurdity of it all pressed down hard. 72 years of working, saving, raising a daughter, and now I had to prove my sanity in front of strangers. Inside, the courtroom hummed with a kind of restrained anticipation. Shanda sat beside Travis, her back straight, hands clasped in her lap. Her eyes didn't wander toward me once. Travis, though, wore his confidence like a suit of armor, nodding at the lawyer they'd hired, smirking as if the outcome was already written. When the judge called the case to order, Travis rose with a kind of swagger I hadn't seen before. He laid out his evidence like a man setting traps. Bank records with highlighted withdrawals that looked odd out of context. Letters supposedly written by neighbors, claiming I'd been confused, forgetful. Then, the crown jewel of his fabrication, a doctor's note declaring possible signs of decline, with my name scrawled at the bottom. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. I could feel the judgment in the air, the whispers that maybe they'd been right all along. For a moment, fear gripped me. To see your own life twisted into a case against you is a special kind of humiliation. But when my attorney stood and asked to cross-examine, I forced myself to breathe steady. When the questions came, I answered slowly, clearly. That $1 and $200 withdrawal, it paid for the new roof shingles, and I still had the receipt folded in my coat pocket. The forgotten gas bill. I'd set up automatic payments 6 months ago, and could quote the confirmation number by heart. Each detail, each recollection chipped away at their narrative. I wasn't faltering. I was steady, sharper than they expected. I caught Shanda's eyes once, for the first time since this nightmare began. Doubt flickered there. She knew me. She knew I wasn't the senile caricature Travis was painting. But she looked away, as if admitting it would tear apart the foundation she'd built with him. The judge's brow furrowed as he studied the so-called evidence. Inconsistencies appeared, signatures that didn't match, statements that felt rehearsed. Then came Janice. She stepped forward, her voice trembling but strong enough to carry. She'd overheard Travis at the reception, bragging that he'd take the old man's property by Christmas. The room shifted, like the walls themselves exhaled. Lorraine shifted in her seat, her face pale, unable to meet my eyes. But the turning point came when I pulled from my folder the papers I'd saved, receipts, dated letters, small but undeniable proof of my steadiness. The judge compared them against the evidence Travis had brought. The forged doctor's note crumbled under scrutiny. The signature didn't align. The clinic denied ever issuing it. Travis, once smirking, now fidgeted, his charm slipping like paint in the rain. And the judge leaned back, steepling his fingers. There is more than enough here to question the validity of the petition, and to consider whether fraudulent activity has been committed. His gavel struck lightly, postponing the guardianship ruling, but the shift was unmistakable. The weight that had pressed on me for months suddenly slid onto Travis's shoulders. For the first time in months, the weight was no longer on my shoulders. It shifted to his. The house felt quieter than usual that evening, as if even the walls had taken sides and chosen to keep their silence. Rain tapped against the windows, steady and persistent, the sound filling the spaces where laughter used to live. The courthouse battle was behind me for now, but the emptiness that followed was worse than the noise of accusation. It lingered in every corner, pressing down with the weight of things unsaid. Sitting in my chair, I let the rhythm of the storm carry me. There was no anger left, only a tired calm, like a man waiting at the edge of a long night. The documents on the table reminded me that the fight wasn't over, but for the moment, the rain kept me company. A knock broke through the quiet, sharp and uncertain. At first, I thought it might be the lawyer calling unannounced, but when I opened the door, my daughter stood there, alone. Shanda's shoulders were hunched against the rain, her dress damp at the edges. She looked smaller than she had at the wedding, younger, somehow, though the lines of worry around her eyes betrayed a different truth. Neither of us spoke at first. She stepped in hesitantly, glancing around the familiar room as if it no longer belonged to her. The silence stretched, heavy and awkward, until she finally said, "Dad, I thought maybe we should talk." Her words were soft, but they trembled with something deeper. I motioned for her to sit, though she hovered near the doorway instead, clutching her purse like a shield. "You think it's all a misunderstanding," I said quietly, reading the words she couldn't bring herself to finish. Shanda nodded, biting her lip. "Travis said the petition was just protection for you, so that if anything happened, everything would be taken care of. He made it sound like the right thing." I studied her face, the one I had watched grow from childhood into this conflicted woman. The rain outside beat harder, like it was waiting for her answer too. "Do you believe that?" My voice carried no anger, only a calm that cut deeper than shouting ever could. "Or do you just believe him?" Her eyes fell to the floor. She couldn't hold my gaze. That alone told me what her mouth refused to admit. Memories rose unbidden, the long nights patching her scraped knees, the piano lessons I paid for when money was thin, the college tuition that came at the cost of my health. They filled the silence between us until I finally spoke them aloud, each one landing heavier than the last. "I worked doubles so you'd never feel hunger. I went without so you could stand on those stages and smile. Every piece of me went into giving you a life better than mine. And now I'm told by paper and pen that I can't even be trusted with my own name." My voice cracked, not with weakness, but with the unbearable mixture of love and betrayal. Shanda's tears broke free, streaming silently as she twisted her purse strap. "Dad, I never wanted to hurt you. I just—" Her words faltered, drowned by the sound of rain pounding harder against the glass. I leaned forward, steadying my hands on the cane, letting my breath fill the space. "Listen to me. I will not sign away my life. I won't surrender to anyone's idea of convenience. If you choose to stand with him, then you'll have to live with it. But I won't beg you. Shanda, not for this." The room hung still. My words seemed to ripple through her, unsettling her in a way Travis never had. She pressed a hand to her mouth, sobbing quietly, but made no promises. Without another word, She turned and slipped back into the rain, leaving behind the faint scent of damp perfume and the echo of her indecision. I sat alone once more, the ache in my chest sharper than before, yet strangely lighter. There was no desperation left, only resolve. Silence no longer felt like defeat. It felt like armor, thin, perhaps, but mine to wield. The phone rang later that night, cutting through the storm. My lawyer's voice carried urgency. A new court date had been set. The battle wasn't waiting. Neither could I. I hung up the phone and stared at the dark window, the reflection of an old man looking back at me, not broken, not erased, but bracing for the final reckoning. The courtroom was as still as a church before dawn, the kind of silence where every cough, every shift in a chair, seemed too loud. Sunlight filtered weakly through the tall windows, streaking across the polished wood and catching the dust in the air. My hands rested on the cane in front of me, steady this time. Not from strength alone, but from resolve. Across the aisle, Travis sat with that familiar smirk carved into his face, as if victory had already been etched into stone. Shanda, beside him, trembled, her hands clasped together, knuckles pale, her eyes darting toward me and then away again. Lorraine leaned back, lips pursed, every inch of her satisfied to let someone else do the talking for her. Eldon and Marla sat rigid, whispering to one another like spectators at a play. When the judge cleared his throat, the entire room seemed to lean forward. The verdict began with measured words, each one falling like a gavel strike of its own. The petition, the claims of my incapacity, the so-called evidence, it was all unraveled, piece by piece. The forged signatures, the fabricated bank statements, the manipulation. Each detail stripped away Travis's mask until the smirk slipped from his face. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom, gasps rising as the truth unfolded. Eldon lowered his head. Marla stared at the floor. Lorraine's composure cracked just enough to reveal the tension hiding underneath. The judge's voice grew firmer. This court finds the petition invalid. Ownership and authority remain with Mr. Orville Kempler. Relief came not as a cheer, but as a weight lifting off my chest. Months of humiliation, suspicion, and silence fell away in that moment. For the first time in too long, the truth stood taller than the lies. Then came the sound I wasn't expecting, a sob, soft at first, then rising. Shanda. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. When she lifted her head, her eyes were wet, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dad, I'm sorry." It wasn't rehearsed, wasn't elegant. It was raw, torn out of her like something she'd held too long. The courtroom watched her break. The daughter who had signed her name against her father now facing the shame of it in front of strangers. Travis shot to his feet, red with fury. He muttered curses under his breath and stormed out, his polished shoes echoing like the last sound of a battle lost. Shanda stayed seated, her apology lingering between us. It wasn't everything. It didn't erase what had been done, but it was something. A crack in the wall Travis had built between us. When the session adjourned, I rose carefully, my cane tapping the marble floor. Outside, the cool air hit like a blessing. Janice met me near the steps, her hand warm on mine. "You did right, Orville," she said quietly, her eyes steady with respect. Lorraine passed by without a word, bitterness clinging to her like perfume too strong for comfort. The courthouse steps stretched before me, each one carrying me not into old age, but into a dignity reclaimed. My head lifted higher than it had in months. Back home, the silence greeted me again, but it was different now, not empty, peaceful. The rain that had haunted my nights was clearing, a faint glow of early spring dusk pushing through the clouds. I sat in my chair, the guardianship papers long gone, the shadows on the wall softer now. Shanda's apology echoed faintly. I knew trust would not return in a single day, maybe not at all. But for the first time, there was space for healing, however small. In the stillness, I felt Evelyn's presence, not as a ghost but as a whisper in my heart. "You did right." Her voice, imagined or real, wrapped around me like the last thread of strength I needed. Looking out the window, I thought of all the fathers like me, men who had given everything, only to find themselves treated as relics, and I knew the truth I wanted to leave behind. We are not relics to be discarded. We are the roots that hold the tree upright. I closed the curtain that night, not in defeat, but in peace, knowing I had kept my dignity, and that was more than enough.